Welcome to Bloomberg Markets. I'm Kriti Gupta. Apple will face a European Union fine close to about 500 million euros over the regulator's investigations. The allegations it silenced music streaming rivals, including Spotify. I want to bring in Bloomberg Intelligence analyst Matt Bloxham to walk us through this story. Matt, this is historic in a lot of ways, but some would say it really doesn't matter because I think the 500 million euros is something like 11 hours of revenue for Apple. Your take?
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to a complaint that Spotify made way back in 2019 about, kind of alleged anti-competitive practices by Apple around its music services in the App Store. And we were expecting the EU to come out with this fine maybe early next month, and we'll have to kind of work through the details of what they actually say. But yeah, it's kind of a bit irrelevant, I think, in a number of ways. One, the fine, even though it feels big, it's not big at all to Apple. The second is that since then, the European Union has moved forward with the various kind of digital legislation, and particularly the Digital Markets Act.
Yeah.
And you might remember a few weeks ago, Apple came out with a big press statement saying we're changing how we do business in the EU markets, and a lot of what they're changing kind of responds to some of the alleged, anti-competitive practices that were at stake in this case. And obviously the main thing here is that Apple wasn't letting people like Spotify advertise cheaper ways to get the service outside of the App Store, and Apple's making a whole bunch of changes, including allowing people to have their own app stores, not just the Apple one. And if you stay on the Apple's App Store, you'll get lower fees. They'll take a kind of 10 to 15% cut, maybe, on the kind of 15 to 30%. And in any case, Spotify some years ago started to move people away from paying for the subscription through Apple. You can't actually pay for Spotify through the Apple service anymore anyway. So I don't think it's going to be any kind of big revenue effect, and the fine is irrelevant. So I think the world has moved on since this case started, and it's the European Commission trying to kind of show its teeth, and that it's really kind of getting to grips with these kind of big gatekeeper technology companies.
I mean, there's an argument here, and I can't remember who said this, but basically, as the European Commission, the CMA even arguably here, trying to kind of rein in big tech, but the fines that they're imposing are simply too small. Matt, as we talk about this kind of regulatory environment where Europe does go harder on big tech, and arguably some of even the bigger companies here in Europe, is there a number that will actually matter to a lot of these big tech names, just given the pace that they're growing at?
I think not. I think what's more important is the change behavior, and that's obviously what the Digital Markets Act is trying to do and what Apple's responded to. And so we'll have to wait and see whether the European Commission says that what Apple's proposed is sufficient. I think that's the bigger constraint on how they actually operate. I mean, in theory, you can fine a company up to 10% of that revenue. Now, that would be significant, but I think you can imagine if the EU came out and fined Apple 10% of its global revenue, the case would drag on for years and years, if not decades, in the courts. It wouldn't really change things. What matters is kind of strong legislation that forces a company to change its behavior, and that's what the DMA is trying to do.
I know, it's a really interesting dynamic then, because it speaks to this idea of, does this kind of regulatory action even matter until how Apple reacts in Europe sets some sort of precedent for how they react to the rest of the world. And I think that applies to other big tech names as well. Nvidia, for example, they're reporting earnings this week. On top of announcements overnight of SoftBank investing, I think, $100 billion in new chips. Talk to us about the chip story here. When does the chip story get old?
Never. I think it's the reality.
Not anytime soon.
The world is, completely reliant on technology. I can't see that ever changing, and it's just going to continue to be an evolution, almost like a kind of arms race, if you like, in the kind of technology space. Chips are going to have to continue to get more and more sophisticated. New innovations will come out. So I think this story is just going to keep us going, for decades to come, I think.
A really interesting dynamic. Again, and it speaks to this idea of, if you're talking about this innovation, $100 billion, for example, from the likes of SoftBank, Nvidia growing into server chips, Apple then kind of rejigging their business. Do you want exposure to it, or is it too expensive? Matt, I'm not going to make you answer that. Matt Bloxham of Bloomberg Intelligence, we thank you so much.